Modern-day Iraq, nearly 800 years ago. Baghdad, the winter of 1257. I'm Ethan, and we're about to walk through the greatest city on earth in its final months of existence. Baghdad. The year is 1257, and the city stands as the intellectual capital of the known world. With over 1 million residents packed along both banks of the Tigris, Baghdad dwarfs every city in Europe combined. The House of Wisdom holds more books than all the libraries of Christendom. Scholars here are calculating the circumference of the Earth, translating Aristotle, mapping the stars, while most of Europe still can't read. This is the beating heart of the Islamic Golden Age, 5 centuries in the making. But in just a few months, an army from the eastern steppes would arrive at its gates. And when they left, the river would run black with ink and red with blood. I've used modern AI to reconstruct Baghdad at its 1257 peak and during its final catastrophic week. We're going to walk its streets, enter its greatest libraries, and witness how the most advanced city on earth met total annihilation. Baghdad wasn't built by accident. In 762 AD, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur chose this spot on the Tigris deliberately. Fertile land, a river for trade and drinking water, a position between Persia and the Mediterranean. He called it Madinat al-Salam, the city of peace, and designed it as a perfect circle. 3 concentric walls with the Caliph's palace and the Great Mosque at the exact center. By 1257, that circular core had exploded outward into sprawling districts on both riverbanks, connected by pontoon bridges of lashed boats that swayed with the current. The round city itself, nearly 2 kilometers across, remained the administrative heart. But Baghdad had long since outgrown its original design. 5 centuries of continuous growth had made it, by most estimates, the largest city on the planet. At the center of everything stood the House of Wisdom, Bayt al-Hikma. This wasn't merely a library, it was a research institute, a translation bureau, and an observatory rolled into one, employing scholars regardless of faith. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, all working side by side. Here, scholars had translated the complete works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, Euclid, and Galen from Greek into Arabic, centuries before Europe would rediscover them. Al-Khwarizmi had written the foundational texts of algebra within these walls. The word itself comes from his book's title. Ibn al-Haytham had revolutionized optics, proving that vision worked through light entering the eye, not rays emanating outward as the Greeks believed. The library's collection numbered in the hundreds of thousands of volumes, some estimates reaching 1 million manuscripts, dwarfing anything Europe would possess for another 300 years. Paper, imported via the Silk Road from Chinese prisoners captured a century earlier, had made mass copying possible in a way parchment never could. Scribes worked in shifts, copying texts around the clock. Walk south from the House of Wisdom and you'd reach the bustling markets along the Tigris, where merchants from China, India, East Africa and Scandinavia traded goods that had traveled thousands of miles. Silk from Guangzhou, spices from the Malabar coast, furs from the Rus territories carried down the Volga by Viking traders who'd converted their longships into river barges. Baghdad sat at the crossroads of 3 continents, and its markets reflected that. Over 100 distinct trading districts, each specializing in specific goods: the paper market, the perfume market, the slave market, the book market, where you could purchase manuscripts on medicine, astronomy, poetry, or Quranic law from dealers who knew their inventory by heart. The call to prayer echoed 5 times daily from hundreds of minarets across the city, a sound so constant that visitors described it as the city's heartbeat. The wealthy lived in riverside mansions with private gardens, courtyards cooled by wind-catching towers called badgirs that funneled breezes down into subterranean chambers. Indoor plumbing, unheard of in contemporary Paris or London, was common in elite households, with clay pipes carrying water throughout multi-story homes. Public bathhouses, hammams, numbered in the thousands, serving ordinary residents who bathed regularly in an era when most of Europe considered bathing dangerous to health. Hospitals, called bimaristans, offered free treatment to anyone regardless of ability to pay, staffed by physicians trained in institutions that taught anatomy, pharmacology, and surgery using texts that wouldn't reach European medical schools for centuries. The Adudi Hospital, built in 981, had separate wards for different ailments, a library, and lecture halls where students trained under practicing physicians, essentially a teaching hospital, an institution Europe wouldn't develop until the 18th century. But beneath this prosperity, cracks had been spreading for years. The Abbasid Caliphate, once commanding vast territory, had fractured into a patchwork of semi-independent regions. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, held religious authority as the spiritual head of Sunni Islam, but his actual military power had withered. His army, by most accounts, numbered perhaps 20,000, a fraction of what the city's population and historical prestige might suggest. Advisors warned him repeatedly to strengthen the city's defenses, to make peace with the rising Mongol threat, or at minimum, to prepare for the possibility of siege. Al-Mustasim, by most historical accounts, dismissed these warnings, reportedly telling his ministers that Baghdad had never fallen and never would, protected by divine favor and the sheer weight of Islamic history. He had no idea that 4,000 kilometers to the east, a grandson of Genghis Khan was already marching west with orders that left no room for negotiation. Hulagu Khan commanded one of the largest armies the Mongol Empire had ever assembled. Estimates range from 150,000 to over 250,000 soldiers, drawn from across the empire's vast territories, supplemented by Chinese siege engineers who brought with them technology no army in the Islamic world had encountered. Counterweight trebuchets capable of hurling stones over 100 kilograms with devastating accuracy, and early gunpowder-based incendiary weapons. Hulagu's brother, the Great Khan Monk, had given explicit instructions. The Mongols were done tolerating independent powers who refused submission. Baghdad, as the symbolic and spiritual capital of the Islamic world, was the ultimate target. Hulagu sent messengers ahead, demanding surrender. Al-Mustasim refused, reportedly boasting that if the Mongols attacked, the very stars would rearrange themselves to Baghdad's defense, that all of Islam would rise to crush the invaders. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The wider Islamic world, fractured and mutually hostile, sent no meaningful help. By January 1258, Hulagu's forces had surrounded the city. His army encircled Baghdad on both banks of the Tigris, cutting off any hope of escape or reinforcement, while his engineers began constructing siege works and positioning trebuchets within range of the walls. The bombardment began within days, stones and incendiary projectiles raining down continuously, day and night, targeting the walls, the towers, the gates. Baghdad's defenses, designed centuries earlier for different kinds of threats, buckled under sustained Chinese siege engineering. On January 29th, Mongol forces breached a section of the eastern wall. Panic spread through the city as residents realized what was coming. Al-Mustasim, finally grasping the severity of his situation, attempted negotiations. But by then, Hulagu had no interest in mercy. On February 10th, after less than 2 weeks of siege, Baghdad's gates opened. The city that had stood as the world's intellectual capital for 5 centuries surrendered. What followed has few parallels in recorded history. For 7 days, Mongol forces conducted what modern historians describe as a systematic, deliberate massacre. Contemporary chroniclers, including the Persian historian Atta Malik Juvaini, who traveled with the Mongol army, and later accounts drawing on eyewitness testimony, describe corpses filling the streets in such numbers that disease became an immediate secondary threat. Estimates of the dead vary enormously across historical sources, from the low hundreds of thousands cited by some scholars to over 1 million claimed by others, though modern historians generally consider figures toward the lower end more plausible given the city's population. What's certain is that the killing was comprehensive. Scholars, craftsmen, merchants, religious leaders, ordinary residents. Caliph al-Mustasim himself was captured. According to widely repeated accounts, Hulagu, wary of Mongol taboos against spilling royal blood directly, had the caliph wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. Though some modern historians question the precise details of this story, while agreeing on the caliph's execution, the destruction extended beyond human life to the city's intellectual soul. the House of Wisdom, containing what may have been the greatest concentration of scientific and philosophical knowledge on Earth, was destroyed. Soldiers reportedly threw hundreds of thousands of manuscripts into the Tigris. So many books, according to accounts passed down through generations, that the river ran black with dissolved ink for days, while in other telling, the water ran red from the blood of scholars slaughtered in the streets, sometimes both colors mixing in the current simultaneously. Whether every detail of these accounts is literally precise or partly embellished by later chroniclers, processing an incomprehensible loss, the underlying reality is beyond dispute. Centuries of accumulated human knowledge, irreplaceable manuscripts on mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy, works that existed nowhere else, vanished in days. Historians still debate how much irretrievable scientific and philosophical work was lost forever, work that might have accelerated human knowledge by generations had it survived. The mosques, palaces, hospitals, and observatories that had taken 5 centuries to build were burned, looted, or left in ruins. The irrigation canals that had sustained the region's agriculture for millennia were deliberately destroyed, an act with consequences that would outlast the massacre itself by centuries, as Mesopotamia's agricultural productivity never fully recovered. When the killing finally stopped, Baghdad's population had been reduced by a catastrophic margin. By some estimates, from over 1 million residents to perhaps a tenth of that number, though precise figures remain contested among historians, given the chaos and the varying reliability of contemporary sources. The city that had produced algebra, revolutionized optics, and translated the accumulated wisdom of Greek antiquity for the world lay in ruins. Its libraries ash, its canals broken, its population decimated. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had governed the Islamic world in some form for over 500 years, effectively ceased to exist as a political power. A surviving member of the Abbasid family would later be installed as a ceremonial caliph in Mamluk Cairo, but the political and intellectual center of the Islamic world had shifted permanently away from Baghdad. The rebuilding, when it eventually came, was slow and never fully restored the city's former preeminence. Baghdad would remain a significant regional city under successive rulers, the Ilkhanate, then various local dynasties, eventually the Ottomans, but the singular concentration of scholarship, wealth, and intellectual achievement that had defined it for 5 centuries never returned in the same form. Some historians argue the Mongol destruction of Baghdad's irrigation infrastructure alone set Mesopotamian agricultural output back for centuries, permanently altering the region's economic trajectory. Others point to the psychological and cultural shock across the Islamic world. The sense that if Baghdad, protector of the faith and seat of the Caliphate, could fall so completely, nothing was truly secure. Some scholars argue this event marked a turning point, one contributing factor among many in the Islamic world's gradual shift away from the open, syncretic scholarship that had defined its golden age. Though historians continue to debate how much weight to give this single catastrophic event versus the many complex, gradual forces already reshaping the region. What makes Baghdad's story different from Persepolis or Pompeii is the deliberateness of it. This wasn't a natural disaster indifferent to human achievement, nor a drunken celebration that spiraled out of control. This was calculated policy, executed with the same engineering precision that had built the trebuchets that breached the walls. A conqueror decided that a 500-year concentration of human knowledge should end, and it ended within a week. And yet, something survived, scattered and fragmentary. Scholars who fled before the siege, or who managed to escape the massacre, carried fragments of Baghdad's intellectual tradition to Cairo, to Damascus, to the Islamic centers of Spain, where some of that knowledge would eventually flow into Europe through Latin translations, contributing to the intellectual currents that would help fuel the European Renaissance centuries later. The mathematics, the medicine, the astronomy that Baghdad's scholars had preserved and expanded for 500 years didn't vanish entirely. It dispersed, diluted, incomplete, but not extinguished. Ironically, much of what we know about the sophistication of Baghdad's House of Wisdom comes precisely from these scattered fragments and the accounts of scholars who survived to describe what had been lost. Today, modern Baghdad sits atop the ruins of that medieval capital, a city that has weathered further waves of conflict and destruction in the centuries since, each layer of history compounding on the last. The Tigris still flows through the city centre, though the pontoon bridges and the perfect circular walls of Al-Mansur's original design are long gone, buried under centuries of subsequent rebuilding. Archaeologists have recovered fragments, manuscript pages, architectural remnants, administrative records that hint at the scale of what once existed here, though the overwhelming majority of Baghdad's medieval intellectual output is simply gone, lost in those 7 days in February 1258. What does Baghdad's destruction teach us? That the accumulation of human knowledge, however vast, however seemingly permanent, remains fragile in the face of deliberate destruction. 5 centuries of scholarship, 5 centuries of scientific advancement, 5 centuries of medical knowledge that could have saved countless lives. All of it existed in a form concentrated enough that a single military campaign, executed over a matter of weeks, could erase the overwhelming majority of it. We live now in a world where knowledge is distributed, digitized, backed up across continents and servers, seemingly immune to the kind of singular catastrophic loss Baghdad suffered. But the lesson embedded in the ash and ink of the Tigris River remains relevant. Civilizations build, accumulate, and preserve knowledge across centuries, believing permanence is guaranteed by achievement alone. Baghdad believed that too. The House of Wisdom stood for nearly 500 years before it burned in a week. We're still living with the echo of what was lost there. The mathematics we use, the medical knowledge we inherited, filtered through what managed to survive. Baghdad proved that intellectual civilization can reach staggering heights, and Baghdad proved, just as starkly, how quickly it can be extinguished.